The night before the hanging came down slow and heavy, like a blanket laid over a wounded land, and Caleb Hargreaves sat alone in the narrow wooden cell beneath the gallows, listening to the wind worry the ropes above him as if they were already testing his weight, the boards creaking with each restless breath of the desert, the moonlight slipping through the barred window in pale strips that crossed his boots, his hands, his face, hands that had once held guns with too much ease, a face known across territories by wanted posters that lied as much as they told the truth, and now there was nothing left to do but wait, because the sheriff had granted him one last night alone, no preacher, no guard, no questions, perhaps out of pity or perhaps because even men paid to uphold the law did not want to sit too close to a soul already halfway gone, and Caleb leaned back against the wall, feeling the cold would press into his spine, and he laughed once, quietly, at the thought that this silence was the longest peace he had known in years, because his life had been noise, gunshots cracking like dry thunder, horses screaming, men shouting his name with fear or hate, women whispering it with caution, and yet here, on the eve of his death, it was the wind that spoke the loudest, slipping through the gallows like a voice that knew him, and Caleb closed his eyes and let that sound pull him backward through time, to the things no one ever asked about, the things he never offered. Because legends did not have room for tenderness, and fear did not sell well when mixed with truth, and so he began to speak, not loudly, not to anyone in the room, but to the night itself, to the wood and rope and dust that would soon remember him better than people ever had, and he confessed that he had not always been an outlaw, that once there was a boy who believed in straight roads and honest work, who learned to read by lantern light while his mother slept coughing in the next room, who dreamed of buying a small patch of land where nothing had to be taken at gunpoint, and that boy still lived somewhere inside him, small and bruised, watching every crime with wide eyes, asking each time if this would finally be the last, and Caleb admitted that the first man he ever killed was not in a robbery or a shootout but on a riverbank at dusk, when fear moved faster than thought and a knife flashed where a hand should have reached out, and he remembered the way the water kept flowing as if nothing had happened, teaching him the hardest lesson of the West, that the world did not pause for blood, and after that night, something in him broke open, not into cruelty, but into distance, a quiet place where he could do what needed doing and still hear his own breathing afterward, and he told the darkness that the stories about him were wrong in the ways that mattered most, that he did not rob for pleasure, did not kill for pride, did not ride with laughter on his lips, because each job was chosen like a stone added to his pockets while wading deeper into a river he no longer believed he could cross, and then there was the secret, the one no one knew, the one that pressed against his chest now harder than the noose ever would, the truth that if spoken earlier might have burned towns down or saved lives or perhaps done both, and Caleb swallowed and confessed that the blood-soaked legend of his name was built on a lie he chose to carry, because years ago, in a mining town that no longer existed except in ashes and rumor, he had been there the night a massacre happened, but he had not led it, had not ordered it, had not even fired the first shot, yet when the smoke cleared and the survivors needed a devil to point at, he stepped forward into that role, because the man truly responsible was someone the town trusted, someone with a badge and a smile and a brother buried under a false name, and Caleb had seen the fear in the eyes of a woman hiding beneath a floorboard, clutching a child, and he knew that if the truth came out, that woman would not live to see the next sunrise, so he took the blame like a sin willingly chosen, letting the West write his name in blood so others could walk free of it, and the wind moaned through the gallows as if it understood, and Caleb felt the weight of that choice now more clearly than ever, because history would not change its mind tomorrow morning when the trapdoor fell, and no one would know that the outlaw they hanged had once turned away from escape to draw gunfire toward himself so a family could slip out the back. No one would care that he had paid for that mercy with a lifetime of being hunted, and he wondered, quietly, if sacrifice only mattered when someone survived to speak of it, and as the night deepened, he spoke of love once, just once, because even legends needed a soft place to die, and he admitted there had been a woman, Clara Bell, with hands that smelled of soap and wheat, who saw past the wanted posters and asked him questions he could not answer without giving everything away, and he left her one morning without a word, believing absence was kinder than truth, and he never knew if she understood or if she cursed his name like the rest, and that regret sat heavier in him than any chain, because violence he could explain to himself, but love abandoned stayed sharp forever, and when he finally fell silent, the confession hanging in the air like smoke, the moon had climbed higher, the wind had softened, and Caleb Hargreaves sat alone with the knowledge that by morning his secret would die with him, sealing the legend exactly as the West preferred it, simple, brutal, and wrong, yet for this one night, In the quiet between creaking ropes and shifting stars, the truth had existed, spoken into the dark, and that, he thought, might be enough. She arrived in Red Mesa just after dawn, when the desert still held a trace of cool and the sun had not yet burned the color from the world, riding in a plain wagon with no markings and no hurry, her black dress already dusty from miles of travel, her face calm in a way that unsettled the men who watched from porches and doorways, because everyone in Red Mesa knew the stories before they knew her name, and when someone finally whispered it, Eliza Moreno, the sound moved through the town like a slow wind through dry grass, carrying fear with it, because Eliza Moreno was the widow people spoke of in low voices, the woman whose husbands and lovers had all died violently, some shot, some hanged, some found alone beneath open skies with blood in the sand, and no one could say she had pulled a trigger or tied a knot, yet death seemed to follow her like a vow, and so the men of Red Mesa watched her pass with eyes full of caution and something darker beneath it, that mix of desire and dread that often lived side by side in lonely places, and Eliza felt it without looking, because she had learned long ago how silence could speak louder than words, how grief could sharpen the senses, and she guided her wagon to the edge of town, where a small adobe house stood empty, its walls cracked, its door crooked, but its porch facing the long stretch of desert that caught the sunset just right, and she chose it without explanation, paid in cash, unpacked only what she needed, and by nightfall a lamp glowed in her window as if she had always been meant to be there, though the town did not believe that for a moment, and the first days passed quietly, Eliza keeping to herself, buying supplies, offering polite nods but no stories, while the town offered her the same in return, because Red Mesa was not a place that welcomed trouble, and a woman with a reputation like hers felt like trouble walking on 2 feet, and yet time has a way of softening even fear, and it was on the 7th night, when the heat still clung to the air after sunset and cicadas sang like they were trying to drown out memory, that fate arrived at her door in the form of a man bleeding into the dust, his boots dragging a crooked line across the ground. Before his body finally gave out on her threshold, and Eliza heard it, the soft, helpless sound of weight meeting earth, and when she opened the door, the lantern light fell across a stranger's face, pale with pain, his shirt dark with blood at the shoulder, his revolver still holstered as if even wounded he had not meant to frighten her, and for a moment she simply stood there, the past rushing up fast and cruel, because this was how it always began, with a man half dead and fate watching closely, waiting to see if she would turn away, and perhaps she should have. Perhaps any sensible woman would have closed the door and let the town handle it, but Eliza had buried too many men to believe that distance could save her now, so she knelt, pulled him inside with strength born of necessity, and shut the door on the desert and the whispers and the old fear that settled in her chest like a familiar ache, and she worked quietly, cutting fabric, cleaning the wound, speaking only when needed, while the man drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring a name she did not recognize, and when the bleeding slowed and his breathing steadied, she sat back on her heels and studied him, noticing the lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years lived hard, the scar along his jaw that hinted at old fights, and something gentle beneath it all that surprised her, because she had learned to recognize cruelty easily, and this man did not carry it the same way, and when he finally woke fully the next morning, sunlight filtering in through thin curtains, he found her at the table, drinking coffee, her back straight, her face unreadable, and he did not reach for his gun, did not demand answers, only said, "I reckon I owe you my life," in a voice worn smooth by dust and distance, and she replied, "You owe me nothing," because debts had a way of growing heavy and dangerous, and he told her his name was Thomas Calder, a gunslinger by trade and habit, wounded in a fight that had not gone the way he planned, and she told him nothing about herself beyond what he could already see, because she had learned that names carried weight, and hers carried too much, and days passed with Thomas recovering slowly, the wound deep but clean, and in that quiet space something fragile began to form, not sudden or burning, but careful, like two people learning how to breathe in the same room without disturbing old ghosts, and they spoke in the evenings as the heat eased, about small things at first, the sound of the wind, the way the light changed the desert's color, the taste of bad coffee, and then larger things crept in despite their caution, loss mentioned without detail, regret without names, and Eliza found herself listening to Thomas laugh softly at something she said, and the sound caught her off guard, because it had been a long time since she had allowed herself to be the reason for someone's ease, and Thomas, for his part, noticed the way her eyes darkened when she thought no one was watching, the way she touched a small ring she wore on a chain around her neck, and he understood without asking that she carried grief the way some men carried weapons, always within reach, always respected, and when the town finally noticed him walking beside her, arm still stiff but healing, the whispers returned, sharper now, men counting days in their heads, women watching Eliza with a mix of pity and judgment, because everyone knew how this story ended, and Thomas heard enough to piece together the truth, not from her mouth but from the silence that followed it. And one night, standing on the porch with the moon high and the desert stretched wide and listening, he said quietly, "They think I'll die," and Eliza did not deny it, because lies only made fate angry, and she told him, her voice steady though her heart was not, that she did not wish harm on anyone, that love had come into her life like a promise and left like a curse, and that if he wanted to leave, she would not stop him. And Thomas looked at her for a long moment, seeing not a widow of rumor but a woman worn thin by loss, and he said, "I've been running from death my whole life," and stepped closer, not touching her yet. "I won't start running from you," and the space between them closed, not in passion but in understanding, a quiet agreement made beneath the stars, and for a time, it seemed as though fate might be fooled, because Thomas healed fully, took honest work repairing fences and guarding caravans, and the town began, slowly, to loosen its grip on fear. Children waved, merchants nodded, and Eliza allowed herself to imagine a future that did not end in blood, and that hope, fragile and bright, was the most dangerous thing of all, because when trouble came, it came fast, riding in with the heat and the dust and old grudges Thomas had thought buried, men who recognized him not as a ranch hand but as the gunslinger he once was, and Eliza watched from the porch as words turned sharp and hands hovered too close to holsters, her chest tight with a familiar dread, and though Thomas tried to walk away, the West had never been kind to men who wanted to change, and the sound of the gunshot cracked through Red Mesa like a cruel reminder of how stories repeated themselves, and when the dust settled, Thomas lay in the street, wounded again, this time deeper, and Eliza was there before anyone else, kneeling in the dirt, pressing her hands to his chest, her tears falling freely now because there was no point in holding them back, and Thomas smiled at her, faint but real, and whispered, "I'm sorry," as if love itself were something to apologize for, and as the town gathered, silent and heavy with the weight of having been right, Eliza held him and wondered if fate ever grew tired of proving itself, and whether love was always meant to end in tragedy in places like this, and though Thomas lived through that night by sheer will and her care, something had changed, because both of them understood now that the shadow had caught up, that Red Mesa would never let them forget the pattern it believed in, and as Thomas slept, pale and breathing shallow, Eliza sat beside him, the widow once more in the eyes of the world, and she realized that loving him meant choosing a path that could only end one way, and the desert outside lay quiet and watching, as if waiting to see what she would do next. Deadwood Crossing announced itself long before a man reached it, the stench of old smoke and sour whiskey riding the wind, the sound of shouting and gunfire drifting across the flat land like a warning meant for anyone with sense enough to turn back, and Jonah Pike had that sense once, back when he still believed a badge could change the shape of a place, but he rode on anyway, hunched slightly in the saddle, his coat worn thin, his horse limping worse than he was, the tin star pinned to his chest dull with age and regret, because Deadwood Crossing had not seen law in years, not since the last marshal bled out in the street and the town learned that no one was coming to save it. And Jonah knew that story better than most, because he had been a marshal once, a good one by other men's measure, until the night he failed so completely that the title became a weight he could barely carry, and as he crossed the rotted wooden bridge into town, heads turned slowly, eyes narrowing, hands drifting toward holsters out of habit more than intent, because Deadwood Crossing belonged to men who had learned to trust only force, and Jonah looked like a man already beaten by it, his face lined, his beard streaked with gray, his left hand stiff from an old injury that never healed right, and someone laughed when they saw the badge, a sharp, mocking sound that echoed between leaning buildings, but Jonah did not react, because he had learned the hard way that pride was just another way to get killed, and he guided his horse down the main street, passing the saloon with broken windows, the jailhouse used now as a gambling den, the church burned out and hollow, each sight stirring memories he wished stayed buried. Because failure had a smell too, and this town carried it thick, and he dismounted slowly near the center of the street, tying his horse to a post that looked like it might give way, and when he stood, the ache in his bones reminded him that he was not the man he used to be, and perhaps that was why he was here, because younger men still believed they could outrun their ghosts, and Jonah Pike knew better, and the first man to approach him was Silas Boone, a heavyset rancher with worry carved deep into his face, who looked at the badge like it might bite, and said, "You lost, Marshal," and Jonah met his eyes and replied, "No," in a voice rough but steady, "I finally found the place that needs me," and that earned him another laugh from the saloon, louder this time, followed by the scrape of a chair and the appearance of Rafe Calder, the man who owned Deadwood Crossing without ever signing his name to it, his hat tilted low, his smile thin and knowing, and Jonah felt the air tighten, because Rafe Calder was the kind of man trouble gathered around willingly. And he said, "Badge don't mean much here," and Jonah nodded, because he already knew that, and answered, "Then I won't lean on it," and something in that answer unsettled the watching crowd, because men like Rafe understood threats and bribes, but quiet certainty made them uneasy, and Jonah walked past him without another word, toward the old jailhouse, and that was when the past came rushing back hard enough to make him stumble, because the last jail he'd walked into wearing a badge had been filled with men screaming for help he could not give, had been the place where his wife, Mary, died when a gang he underestimated set fire to the building to draw him out, and Jonah had made it out alive, his son barely breathing in his arms, only to bury them both days later, and the badge had never felt clean since, and Deadwood Crossing pressed on that wound without mercy, because the town was already preparing for war, not between good and evil, but between men who wanted control and men who were tired of being crushed beneath it, and over the next days, Jonah learned the shape of that war quietly, listening more than he spoke, watching how Rafe's men moved in pairs, how the townsfolk flinched at sudden noise, how no one walked alone after dark, and he slept in the jailhouse office, the cell doors hanging open like broken teeth, the badge beside him on the table as if asking whether it still had meaning, and more than once he considered riding out before things turned bloody, because failure had taught him caution, but each time he saw a child darting out of an alley or an old woman locking her door with shaking hands, he stayed, and when Rafe Calder finally confronted him again, it was not with guns but with an offer. A glass of whiskey slid across a saloon table, a promise of safe passage if Jonah would leave quietly, because war was bad for business, and Jonah listened, the memory of fire and screams rising in his chest, and he said, "I don't want this badge," and Rafe smiled, thinking he'd won, until Jonah finished, "But I'll wear it anyway," and the smile vanished, and the war came whether Jonah wanted it or not, sparked by a beating in the street, then a killing, then another, until Deadwood Crossing stood on the edge of something ugly and final, and Jonah found himself doing what he had sworn never to do again, organizing men, setting watches, cleaning old rifles, because even a broken marshal knew how to prepare for a fight, and the night before it all broke open, Jonah stood alone in the street, staring at the burned church, and spoke softly to the ghosts he carried, telling them he was afraid, telling them he might fail again, but promising he would not run, and when dawn came, it came with gunfire, Rafe's men riding hard, confident in numbers, and Jonah met them not with speeches but with position and patience, using the town's narrow streets against them, taking shots only when needed, moving slower than he once would have but smarter, and men fell. Some good, some bad, the dust turning dark beneath the sun, and Jonah took a bullet in the shoulder that spun him into the dirt, pain blooming hot and bright, and for a moment he lay there, staring up at the sky, thinking this was how it ended after all, but he forced himself up, because the past had already taken everything it was going to get, and when Rafe Calder finally stood across from him, gun raised, disbelief in his eyes, Jonah said nothing, because there was nothing left to explain, and when the smoke cleared, Rafe lay still, the town silent but breathing, and Jonah sank to his knees, the badge heavy against his chest, because victory did not feel like redemption, it felt like exhaustion, and as the townsfolk gathered, some cheering, some crying, Jonah realized Deadwood Crossing would need law after today, real law, men younger and stronger than him, and as the sun climbed higher, he unpinned the badge and set it on the jailhouse desk, knowing he had finally worn it for the right reason, even if only once more, and as he rode out of Deadwood Crossing, wounded but alive, the town behind him quieter than it had been in years, Jonah Pike did not feel whole, but for the first time since that burning night long ago, he felt at peace, and sometimes, in the Wild West, that was the closest thing to justice a man ever got. Black Canyon had a way of swallowing sound, of taking the desert's wide-open silence and twisting it into something heavy and watchful, and Samuel Reed felt that weight long before he ever saw the place, riding alone with a rolled map tucked inside his coat and desperation riding heavier than any stillbag, because Samuel was a man worn thin by bad luck and harder choices, a prospector who had chased rumors from dry riverbeds to abandoned mines until his hands were cracked, his pockets empty, and his hope reduced to something sharp and dangerous, and it was in a nameless trading post weeks earlier that the map had found him, slipped across a table by an old drunk with eyes too clear to be fully lost. A man who whispered of gold buried deep in Black Canyon, gold so rich it glowed in the dark, gold no one had ever carried out because it belonged to something older and crueler than men. And Samuel had laughed then, because men laughed at curses when they were hungry. But when the drunk pressed the map into his hand and said, "It listens," in a voice that trembled with truth, Samuel felt something stir that was not greed alone. And now, days later, as the canyon walls rose around him like the ribs of some ancient beast, he wondered if that stirring had been the first whisper, because the air itself seemed to murmur, low and soft, just beyond understanding, and Samuel told himself it was only the wind slipping through stone, only nerves, only the mind's way of filling silence. Yet when he made camp that first night and stared into his fire, he heard his name spoken clearly from the dark, not shouted, not threatening, but gentle, almost kind, and he froze, his breath caught halfway. Listening hard, but the sound did not repeat, and he laughed shakily at himself, because loneliness could make a man imagine many things, and he slept poorly, dreaming of hands reaching up from the ground, not to drag him down, but to offer him something bright and burning, and in the morning he woke with the taste of ash in his mouth and the map warm against his chest as if it had been held there too long, and as he traveled deeper into Black Canyon, the whispers returned, not always words. Sometimes just sounds like breath against his ear, sometimes promises shaped just enough to be understood, telling him how close he was, how much he deserved what waited ahead, reminding him of every man who had ever laughed at his empty hands, every winter he had nearly starved, every night he had slept beneath open skies with nothing to show for it, and Samuel found himself answering them without realizing, muttering aloud that he only wanted a chance, that he was tired of being nothing, and the canyon answered with echoes that did not quite match his voice, and he reached the old mine on the fourth day, hidden behind a rockfall that looked natural until the map showed him where to push, and when the entrance yawned open, the air that rushed out was cold and smelled faintly of metal and rot, and Samuel hesitated only a moment before stepping inside, lantern raised, heart pounding not with fear but with anticipation so sharp it hurt, and the mind stretched deeper than it should have, the walls glittering faintly with veins that caught the lantern light and threw it back brighter, richer. Until Samuel's breath came fast and his hands shook, because this was no rumor, no drunken lie, this was wealth beyond imagining, and the whispers grew louder now, clearer, praising him, welcoming him, calling him chosen, and he dropped to his knees before a wall of gold so pure it seemed unreal, laughing and crying all at once as he struck it with his pick, the sound ringing through the mine like a bell, and with each strike, the whispers urged him on, told him to take more, to dig deeper, to claim what was owed, and Samuel worked until his arms burned and his lantern dimmed, until his sack was heavy with chunks of glowing ore, and only then did he notice the other sounds beneath the whispers, the low groan of shifting stone, the faint crack of supports that looked far older than they should have been, and fear finally cut through his joy, sharp and cold, because the whispers changed then, their tone turning impatient, reminding him that gifts came with prices, that nothing taken from Black Canyon ever left unchanged, and Samuel shouted into the dark that he would give anything, that he would pay later, that he just needed to get out, and the canyon seemed to laugh, a deep, rolling sound that shook dust from the ceiling, and the ground trembled as he ran, sack clutched tight, lantern swinging widely, the mine groaning around him as if waking from a long sleep, and when he burst out into the sunlight, gasping, the entrance collapsed behind him with a roar that echoed through the canyon like a closing mouth, and Samuel fell to the ground, laughing again, wild and broken, because he was alive, because the gold was real, because he had beaten the curse, and he did not hear the whispers then, not until night fell and he made camp at the canyon's edge, and as he counted the ore by firelight, his joy began to sour, because the gold seemed heavier than before, the glow dulling, the surface darkening like something bruised, and the whispers returned, closer now, inside his head rather than in the air, reminding him of his promise, asking gently what he would give, and Samuel clutched his ears, shouting that he had already taken the gold, that the bargain was done, but the voices laughed softly and showed him images instead, memories rising unbidden, his brother's face the winter he died of fever, the woman he had loved and left because he could not bear to be poor, the men he had cheated, the kindness he had refused because it cost too much, and the whispers told him the price was not his life, not yet, but the weight of all he had buried, that the gold would follow him, that wherever he went, Black Canyon would go too, and Samuel fled at dawn, riding hard for the nearest town, but the desert seemed to stretch endlessly, landmarks shifting when he looked away, the whispers guiding him wrong, turning him in circles until his water ran low and his horse grew restless, and when he finally reached a settlement, dusty and small, the people there recoiled from him, not at his appearance, but at the sound that followed him, because they heard it too, faint but unmistakable, the low murmur that clung to him like smoke, and when he tried to sell the gold, it crumbled in the buyer's hands into blackened dust, worthless and foul-smelling, and Samuel screamed then, a raw, broken sound, because he understood at last that the curse was not meant to kill quickly, but to strip a man piece by piece, to leave him alive long enough to regret every wish, and the whispers softened again, almost tender, telling him there was one way to be free, to return what he had taken, to bring the gold back to Black Canyon and lie with it beneath the stone, and Samuel ran from that thought for days, wandering, starving, the whispers growing harsher as his strength failed, until at last he found himself back at the canyon's edge without remembering the road, the entrance half buried but open just enough, waiting, and Samuel knelt there as the sun set, the voices quiet at last, and he understood that some bargains were never spoken aloud, only felt. And as darkness filled Black Canyon once more, the desert swallowed another story, another man who believed riches could save him, and the whispers faded, patient and satisfied, waiting for the next desperate soul to listen.